I've been watching games a lot recently, and one of the things I've kind of noticed is that they do not get the pitch call. The pitches, like which the pitchers are throwing, like announcing them on TV, they do not get them right a lot. Like both the broadcasters and the people like piping in like what the last pitch was.
And I guess by the break or the way the pitch is, they're not in a vantage point. The announcers really necessarily can see. And he goes, it was a knuckle curve. Like, now how did he know that?
The only thing he can say, especially when you got guys that throw a regular curve and a knuckle curve, because it's one thing if the guy only throws the knuckle curve. I mean, there's only gonna be one ball that moves like that, and it's also tough because like if he throws a curveball and a slider, and he throws one that's kind of moves down and away if he's a right-handed pitcher from a right-handed hitter, was it a curveball or a slider? Only
or a slurve.
Yeah, the only guy that knows is that pitcher and maybe the catcher.
I mean, when you say they get them wrong, most of the time they get it right, but I'm surprised they miss as much as they do. I think that's what you're saying.
It's only really surprising when they're like, that was a really good fastball, and that last pitch they threw was not a fastball, or the vice versa.
So this is your concept, right? It was about pitchers' arsenals, and so you basically said, hey, it's different today. The way the pitchers throw, the way they're approaching it, and that's not the aspect. Is how different is it? Is really what we're looking for.
And I think one of the things mostly that it kind of brought this on was the rise of the slider as established as the dominant breaking pitch, as opposed to the curveball. Now, I think this goes from a couple things. One, sliders are kind of allowed to be any velocity, where curveballs kind of have to be pretty slow. Like you could be Jacob deGrom and throw like a 95-mile-an-hour slider.
Right, you're not going to throw a 90-mile-an-hour curve. I know that's about the top out you could ever throw a curveball, right? Maybe 90.
Maybe 90. That would be a very.
And
it wouldn't be a good curveball. Then I don't think it wouldn't break enough.
You have to have enough time for it to make its break, and that's one of the things about a slower pitch.
So I think it's interesting that you've kind of seen now. I think part of that is that for a long time, up until this year, that 12-6 breaking motion was considered easier to hit than that sweeping 3-9 motion on the slider.
Well, and by the sweeper becoming the pitch du jour this major league season for sure. Everybody's trying. Oh yeah, I was trying the sweeper, and clearly
now guys are struggling with that, and they're able to hit that big looping curveball.
Which I find it used to be the changing the plane, right? So that big looping curveball that came from Uncle Charlie, the 12-6 thing, that was really hard to hit because not only was it moving from one way to the other, it was going down at the same time.
Because look at all those guys. You had the Barry Zitos and the Rich Hills of the world. All these guys with these big looping lefty curveballs. And those guys have basically vanished from the major leagues.
There's very few pure curveball pitchers or primarily curveball pitchers that are making hay in the major leagues. I can think the last one that was primarily a curveball would be Bert Blyleven, who's in the Hall of Fame, who was a curveball pitcher, and I can't think of another one.
I know Dylan Cease throws a particularly nasty knuckle curve, but I don't know if I would classify him as a curveball pitcher.
Any more than Pedro, who had a terrific curveball.
Right. And so I think it was just interesting kind of looking back on this going, okay, well, how have pitcher arsenals kind of developed over time, because certain pitches have moved out of style due to regulation more than anything else. You can't really throw the spitball anymore. But then pitches that I don't think anybody really had even fathomed, like the split finger fastball, appeared and became a regularly used part of pitchers' arsenals. I don't think that was a pitch that was originally discovered early on, and
and it's just a question of, to me, I always think of the split finger fastball and Bruce Sutter and Roger Craig teaching that pitch, the pitching coach and manager of the San Francisco Giants as well, that it was between your two fingers here to through the split finger. It was as wide as you could get, and we were joking when you were a little kid, that I would every night you'd go to bed and I'd put a baseball between your fingers and try to tie it around in there to make it, because being a split finger pitcher, you could be a major leaguer even if you could do nothing else.
Right, if you could throw a good splitter, it's really hard.
Mike Scott, back in the 80s. But that was a fork ball before. It just wasn't thrown between the two fingers. It might have been thrown between, these two fingers.
Right. And it was called a fork ball, not a splitter. So,
But it moved like a splitter in that it had that sort of top-down motion, that sort of topspin almost.
And, now you had a pitch like the knuckleball, which there was always at least one knuckleball guy floating around the major leagues. And I don't think there are any active major league knuckleballers right now.
As a matter of fact, we did our episode 233. Right. That was about the fact that there's only been 32 knuckleball pitchers in the history of Major League Baseball. I don't know why. That still impresses me. Mickey Janis was the last guy to do it for the Orioles.
They'd always followed them as sort of like a conga line.
Oh, yeah.
Chain. Like there was always one guy that was taking over, and then they've just kind of vanished. Now, part of it, I think, is hitters are so good that having a pitch that basically isn't consistent is just not enough. These guys just will hit it.
Right. If you don't know that you can throw it for a strike, and the only thing about a knuckleball is, as Bob Uecker said about catching it, the best way to catch a knuckleball is to wait for it to stop rolling and then pick it up.
Which is I think why R.A. Dickey's Cy Young season is still probably one of the most impressive Cy Young seasons.
I remember that season as a Met fan.
Yeah,
he could throw it for strikes. He threw it. He was ahead of the count all the time.
He was so good. He could throw it for strikes and then not throw it for strikes. He had the ability to pick and choose when he wanted it to be like a strike knuckleball and one where he's just like, hey, your guess is as good as mine on this one.
Right. I think you touched on something that was really cool, and that is because of the hitters, right? So you can't get away throwing that, like when they bring in the position players to pitch and they try to throw it, like they end up getting hammered because the idea that the off-speed pitch is going to throw the batter's timing up, no. Not these guys.
Throw them off for like maybe a pitch or
Not these guys.
Like if you like, there was actually a really interesting highlight. I'm blanking on the Jap. There's a pitcher in the NBP who's a submariner who throws a 54-mile-an-hour curveball. And you watch and you can see why it's difficult to hit, but that's because he throws other pitches with it. So he's got an actual fastball he throws, and then occasionally he just throws the fastball that's like the pitch that's like 30 miles an hour slower than his other ones, and he's just like and you just can't hit the thing at that point. You have those like was it Tanaka or was it Darvish that had that crazy slow ball that he would throw occasionally?
I don't know that Tanaka did. He might have, but Darvish has 10 pitches or 11, which I think is the most of any major league pitcher.
I think a lot of that was just him throwing one of his pitches in a slightly different way and him calling it a new pitch. Like, oh, I'm going to throw this curveball, but it'll be like 50 instead of 70. And now it's a gyro ball.
But arsenals have changed because of the hitters. I was reading about a young pitcher this week saying, so I was pitching against this guy, and so I had to learn this power slider. But why? Because I have nothing else to throw this guy. He's going to hit it. And so these guys are so good, and there's such their ability to recognize and make an adjustment is so much better today.
And I think that's why we were talking about this before the episode. We've seen sort of the death of the nibblers.
You raised that point, the death of them. So would you consider Maddox to be a nibbler such that he wouldn't, Greg Maddox?
Greg Maddox would be the prime example of the greatest they could be. Like he is.
So you still think he'd be successful?
I think Maddox would still be successful because his location was so good. But I also think that nobody would probably be hurt more by automatic balls and strikes than Greg Maddox.
As you're saying that, I was thinking the same thing. And Glavine, too.
Because they probably got more calls from umpires based on who they were than just
the umpire's like, it looked like a strike.
The guy moved out of the way and it came back. Hatcher didn't move his glove. Probably a strike, But I think that Maddox is definitely that. But you had a whole lot of guys that were Maddox-like.
Right.
None of those guys are in the major leagues.
I'll go back.
Hendricks was sort of the last one of those types of guys.
And going back further, a guy you didn't see pitch, you've heard about, who was one of the better pitchers in the 80s. And what I did is we'll go back through the different decades. And if you see some of the best pitchers, and it's really hard to do it in decades because a lot of times they come up in the middle of the decade.
Right, exactly. Guy
really
pitches from 65 to 70.
But Fernando Valenzuela, who I wouldn't consider one of the greatest pitchers of the 80s, one of the better ones, was not a hard thrower. What he had was deception. He could move the ball around, and so it's probably a little harder to do that today, I think, to your point, because you have to have the ability to blow it by a guy, because if these guys wait on you, you're going to be in trouble. Because I think the
issue that you run in if you're a guy that like Fernando Valenzuela or Maddox, if you were pitching in today's major leagues, you're going to be accurate and you're going to be really good at placing the ball. But they're going to punish that one mistake you make so much more often now, I feel like. In terms of it's like their ability to just be like, oh, that wasn't good enough. Because the nice thing is if you have that 97 to 100 mile an hour fastball, you have that big power sweeping slider. Sometimes you can just throw it and go, okay, this is my challenge to you. You hit this now. And if you can't go mano a mano like that, you're almost immediately conceding something to the hitter right there.
Everybody's throwing super hard, right? I was watching the Yankee game yesterday because there's a rain delay in the Met game. And
or more enjoyable.
I was watching the ninth inning, and the Yankees had 2 outs in the ninth inning. Really interesting game, and they came back to win 9-8. And Wandy Peralta's on the mound closing, and Brandon Lau is up, and he gets to a 1-2 count. There's a guy and he fouls off 6 pitches in a row at 1-2. That's good. And Wandy Peralta's throwing everything he has. Like I remember this pitch from the 4th grade. I'm going to throw that one because I can't get you out.
If Nestor Cortez was up on the mound, he would have just started doing ballerina between each pitch just to try and throw the guy off.
And this guy's throwing 97 miles an hour. So this batter just kept the at bat. He ended up flying out, and the game ended being. But you felt like he was gaining on him, Lau, the whole time because he was fouling off a pitch. He fouled off a pitch. And if you couldn't put him away,
and if you keep doing that, eventually he's going to throw one that's good enough for you to hit.
And so if you go back in baseball 100 years, so I went back 100 because once you go back to the dead ball era, it's really hard to sort of evaluate pitchers.
Well, I think you're also going to run into until they stop the guys from cutting up the ball and putting all sorts of stuff on.
Well, so you go back and you start with like Christy Mathewson. He had something that he called a fadeaway, which was a screwball for a right-handed pitcher, and he was a real tall guy. And so at that time, there weren't probably very many people that threw a screwball at all, right?
Right. So just guy gets up there and all this, and the ball
uniqueness of like, what the heck is that ball doing?
The ball broke a different way, and it wasn't like you could have a video of it. So it was like the first time a lot of guys saw that was when they finally got to bat against Christy Mathewson. So he throws 290+ mile an hour fastballs and then throws you a screwball on the third pitch, and you're like, wow, that ball does really break a different way.
And obviously, not to mention Christy Mathewson was a big guy. He was called the Big Six because he wore number 6, and he threw really hard as obviously any good pitcher
they were all
had to.
So you had the Big Six, the Big Train.
The Big Train. Well, so Walter Johnson, one of the things about him, and he also was a fastball pitcher, and I see video of Walter Johnson. So fastball pitcher, obviously, and a curveball, but he threw sidearm. And if you see him, he's like throwing from down here. I'm thinking, how do you have I can't think of too many starting pitchers that throw sidearm that are primarily fastball pitchers.
I can't think of any primarily starting pitcher that throws primarily. That just doesn't happen. Now, I think part of the reason why is, in case you don't know, that will destroy your arm.
Right.
Like, if you don't realize, throwing sidearm is horrific for your arm. It's so
Didn't
bad.
destroy Walter Johnson's arm, though.
Right, but that's the freak of nature didn't get destroyed by it. Like, that's the thing. Because when you're coming from that, your arm is not meant to be going that way. At least when you're coming over the top, it's not as bad.
And so then you had other guys like the next generation, so Lefty Grove and Dazzy Vance was a great pitcher in the 20s and 30s. Fastball pitchers, right? These it wasn't really complicated, right? Fastball, curveball, they might have. I don't even know, that
maybe
every
a
pitcher
changeup.
Yeah, not every pitcher had a changeup.
Right, because back then, probably being a guy that threw in the 90s and was reasonably accurate, and especially if you had a good off-speed pitch then, either a curveball or a changeup, you would probably overmatch the vast majority of hitters.
And the general thinking is that these guys like Walter Johnson, who were fastball pitchers, and Dazzy Vance, how would I like the names of my 1920s? Lefty Grove, Dazzy Vance.
I thought it was Dizzy.
No,
that's Dizzy Dean.
That's Dizzy Dean. He's later. Dazzy Vance and Epirixie. They had some really good names back then. But the idea, they threw instead of throwing 95 to 100 on average, 90 to 95. So it was a little slower.
That's what I expect the best pitchers will be there. And yeah, if you were throwing like that, especially with the lack of, because the other thing is, those four guys might have been the only guys throwing consistently mid-90s. So if you weren't playing them, it wasn't like there was somebody else you could go get batting practice against to train against pitches of that speed. Nowadays, you're like, okay, we're facing Jacob deGrom tomorrow. Go get in the cage. We got to pump out 101 mile an hour fastballs all day.
But over those years, right, then primarily the great pitchers are fastball pitchers first, and then they've got other things they can do. So Bob Feller, Dizzy Dean, you mentioned, these were fastball pitchers who could do other things. Lefty Gomez, not Lefty Grove, we already talked about him. In the 50s and 60s, you had Robin Roberts, fastball pitcher, Warren Spahn. Koufax comes up in the 50s and pitches through the 60s.
But guys are almost always going to be fastball pitchers just because it's a pitcher going to throw the vast majority of the time if you're a starting pitcher, just because it's the throwing ball fast good.
Right. It isn't until you get to so if you get to the 60s and 70s, there's Marichal, Gibson. Like all these guys had curveballs. Seaver had a great curveball.
Some had great curveballs.
But you would not think of Marichal, Gibson, or Seaver as curveball pitchers.
No, they were fastball pitchers. They came in and they threw hard.
And then the other half, the 60s, more 70s, is Nolan Ryan, Steve Carlton. Oh, what a pitcher, Steve Carlton. You really
I don't really know Carlton.
Man.
So what was it? What was he throwing?
Something that people couldn't hit. Basically, in 1972, he won the Cy Young for the Phillies, and they won 59 games. He had 27 wins. of 59. The guy was a horse. He pitched 300 odd innings. He's got the 3,000 strikeouts. He did everything, and he was and a slider. So one of those earlier slider type pitchers. Fastball though had the fastball. Just an unbelievably great pitcher.
Right, and I think what you see is that you start. Carlton probably marks the beginning of the shift as the dominant second pitch, going from a curveball to a slider.
I mean, that's a good call. I think you're right. Of course, Gaylord Perry's in there too, and his specialty was the spitball.
Right. That's not allowed.
The illegal spitball that he made legal. And then you go to the 80s, and you got Clemens, fastball pitcher. I had trouble with this, by the way. So the middle of the decade.
What you would classify Clemens' second pitch as? A split finger? A curveball? What was his second best pitch?
Well, it wasn't the same for his whole career.
No.
I think early in his career, he threw more curveballs, and he might have thrown, but he threw that split later in his career.
Clemens is weird to think about because you have to think about what, like, Red Sox Clemens,
right.
Blue Jays Clemens, Yankees Clemens.
So it wasn't just the 80s for Clemens, so he came up in late 80, 84, 85, pitched a little bit in 86. He had his first big year, so he pitched 5 years in the 80s, if you will. Then he pitched in the 90s. Then he pitched in the 2000s. Dude's just a horse, I mean, just pitch forever. And Blyleven also during that period as a curveball pitcher.
I was wrong. I remember what Clemens' best secondary pitch was. That was the bat. Really, really dangerous.
Just ask Mike Piazza. And how about in the 90s and the 2000s? You had Randy Johnson. Now here's a good one. Randy Johnson was a fastball pitcher, right?
Yes. But his feared pitch was the slider.
Right.
And he threw that same wipeout slider that Chris Sale throws today.
And it's a good comp.
Like that, that's just got to be a nasty pitch from a big left.
And both of them were like Sale is 6'6" or something like that.
And they come from way outside.
Right, so this guy's he takes his first step and he comes to you from the left side. He's coming from all the way out on the outside. It's like 46 feet. It's like Little League distance by the time he lets it go.
And they were talking about with Johnson, it's like, it looked like he was releasing the ball from behind the left-handed batter, and then the ball would come all the way around and break to about your feet.
So even though Randy Johnson would probably be a fastball pitcher to a lot of I think it was his slider that made him a Hall of Fame pitcher.
But the same way, Kershaw has a 95 mile an hour plus fastball, but everybody would say he actually is a curveball pitcher.
Yeah, and I don't know that does he throw even 15% curveballs in a game? I don't think he does.
But that's his signature pitch, is that curveball. Whereas I don't really think of Scherzer or Verlander's got his fastball, but I don't think of Scherzer having really like a signature pitch.
So you're gonna get this done here, because you're right in that the arsenals have changed and the pitch usage is different, right? So these guys will flip on any particular day to a different series of pitches they might have that might be working that day, because the other thing, maybe you don't have a live fastball. I think it was harder to do that 50 years ago or 60 years ago.
You kind of had
those
game.
Other things.
Right. And to people that maybe haven't pitched before, it's kind of hard to fathom that, like, oh, wait, you could just wake up and not have your stuff. Yes, actually, it totally happens. Like, you can't explain why it's just not as sharp and as good as you want, but it's just not sometimes. And you've ever seen that? Like, Jacob deGrom would have those starts where, like, you could tell he didn't have his good stuff, and he would just sort of find and pick a way through and have it. That was sort of when he was first up and coming. That's how we knew he was a good pitcher. Is like, we would be like, he didn't have his stuff tonight, but he still turned in a really quality start.
Yeah, and so deGrom is also a fastball pitcher, obviously, first and foremost, but has had games where he did not throw his fastball as much because he knew it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't his night.
And it's interesting because sometimes with a guy like deGrom, it would almost frustrate you because he has such good secondary pitches that he would almost be like, why are you falling in love with the slider so much? You have a good curveball. You have a good changeup. Just throw all four of them with regularity and no one can hit you. But it's hard, especially if yes, I've thrown 1,000 curveballs in my life, but if you haven't thrown one curveball all your game and then it's bottom of the seventh, 2 out, big pitch, 0-2 pitch, and you get the first curveball thrown right then, that's hard.
Well, that's what the good pitchers try to do is, I'm going to show you something you haven't seen before, at least not tonight. So that's you'll wait for the third at bat maybe to bring that pitch that you haven't done, and just to keep that in the back of his mind going, well, you might throw that.
That could be something as simple as you throw that slider that you've been throwing 93, 94 all night, like 95, and you get that little bit of extra break. It's moving that bit quicker. Now he's like, oh, wait, he can throw that really hard slider now.
But if you go back to the basics,
Yeah.
right, Major League Baseball defines the pitches, and there's video for each of these if you want to see, well, what does it really do? So you can look at the changeup, you can look at a curveball.
And then there's a million different variations.
Right, but a curveball, and invented by Candy Cummings, what a great name so apparently throwing seashells into the water, he conjured up the curveball and gets credit, again, urban legend a lot of the time. He's generally the guy, Candy Cummings, that gets credit for inventing the curveball. The cutter, so that's a real...
Mariano Rivera made a career out of that pitch.
The eephus pitch. You know what
now, see, I have trouble classifying that as its own pitch type because that's just intentionally throwing the ball. That's still a fastball. It's just a slow one.
But everybody knows what it is when you say it. The forkball we described.
Right, forkball, which sort of became the splitter.
Right. I think there are still people that might use that, but the rotation you get off the splitter tumbles more. Mm-hmm. You've got the four-seam fastball. You've got the two-seam fastball. You've got the knuckleball we talked about. You've got the knuckle curve. And I took a look, and there have been knuckle curve specialty pitchers in the major leagues there are right now. Well, Cody Allen, I guess, is done for the most part, but he was a knuckle curve. Matt Barnes, Betances was a knuckle. I didn't know that, a knuckle curve. Archie Bradley, Shane Bieber is a knuckle curve pitcher, pretty good one. Walker Buehler is a knuckle curve pitcher, which I didn't.
Cease is on there too, right?
They don't list him on.
I knew he threw one.
So you've got your knuckle curve, you got your screwball, and boy, there are very few guys.
It's just terrible for your arm.
Really hard on the elbow.
Really hard, because your arm is not meant to try and push the ball like that, and you're just going to throw out your arm. Really
and
fast.
and it was mainly thrown by left-handed pitchers. That's why left-handed pitchers are called screwballs a lot of the time, because it broke into the left-handed batter, but away from the right-handed batter, and that was the real advantage.
That was a real advantage because you really didn't want to throw you wouldn't want to throw a screwball as a lefty to a lefty because you're going into what's
other than they never see it, and there's not as they're not.
You got to look at that. You look at that down and in for lefties as their power zone for whatever reason.
So the slider, the splitter. And we mentioned two-seam fastball. So those are the pitches. So Major League Baseball doesn't even rate the sweeper as
that's just a slider.
Is it a slider? It's different than a slider to me because the slider to me has downward break as well as that right.
Sweeper is almost entirely horizontal.
Correct. It's supposed to be this lateral pitch, which we learned, right, is having the ball be on the same plane is bad, right? So having a big sweeper come in, but all of a sudden guys are not prepared to hit that because maybe they haven't seen it a lot in the past few years.
Also, it's the kind of thing where it's much easier to make an adjustment and hit a 12-6 curveball than a sweeper because if you start the sweeper off in the right place, it'll never be a hittable pitch.
Because it's going to be off the plate by the time it gets there.
Whereas the 12-6 passes, it's going to pass through the hitting zone no matter what you do, really. Now, the difference is both of them stink when they're flat.
They both of them get hit. The pitchers themselves, and we went looking at a database, about 92% have thrown between 3 and 6 pitch types during their careers. So let's think about that. It's not necessarily within the game itself. They're not going to have that many that they're going to break out. But obviously you try something and you try, in the offseason you're tinkering and you get a new teammate and he shows you a grip on something and he's had success with this. And so you need another pitch. And particularly now, with as good as the hitters are, I think there's going to be more pitchers that will have more pitches in their arsenal that they'll have to be able to control and throw because you're not going to get away with it.
The existence of the threat of that other pitch is enough. If you're a pitcher, looking at a guy like Max Scherzer who has 7 different pitches, the thing that's nice about that is if you can throw all of them for a strike, then at any point the hitter really has no idea what's coming and he has to guess. It allows you to kind of wrest control of the at bat back a little bit and make him be trying to guess along to what you're doing. Because if all you're throwing is curveball, fastball, the guys are good enough now that they can see the speed difference and adjust.
Right. And because batters are bigger, pitches are bigger. So I looked at 1960, right? The average player was 5'7", 167 pounds. That seems ridiculously small.
That seems tiny.
Right. And then all the way up till now, 6'1", 200 pounds in 2003. So in 40 years.
They went from a guy that was about 5 inches shorter than me and 40 pounds shorter than me to somebody that's exactly my size.
So the pitchers, get bigger and taller, and I think they throw harder. The hitters probably haven't got as big as the pitchers in terms of their height, because there's a real advantage to being able to
a really tall pitcher is very helpful.
as long as you can keep everything in sync. So, and the downward motion right now that they're talking about throwing that comes from a guy who's 6'6".
That the plane is different starting off. It's coming on a much more angled plane the entire time.
So I think that the arsenals they're not going to invent new pitches, right? There's not. We talk about the fact that where did the sweeper come from? Well, that's just a curveball.
What about Senga's ghost forkball?
I just love that they came up with a name for that thing, because other pitchers like okay, so what is a ghost forkball?
Here's the thing: we are going to see new pitches. Here's why: because every pitcher is missing out on self-marketing opportunities that Senga's doing. If you name and call your own pitches special things, it's like a whole thing for you now. And so guys, I think, are going to start doing it just because it becomes a really good way to market yourself.
And when you talk, it's funny you say, because when you talk about a changeup, right? Well, there are a lot of different kinds of ways you can throw a changeup. When I was a kid, I remember there were a couple guys that threw a palm ball.
Ball, circle
you put the whole
straight
ball
change
in there, and you throw it off the palm of the hand to take speed off of it.
People
I don't know anybody
circle,
that throws one now.
People throw circle split changes.
Right. So why do you do all that? Because obviously your particular way of gripping the ball has it come off with a spin, because no one throws a palm ball because apparently it doesn't spin enough to fool anybody, and they must hit the heck out of it, so nobody throws it.
Really funny, actually. It's really funny you bring that up. So I was watching, I like to watch anime, and there was a sports anime in which the main character's whole thing is that he throws a palm ball. But he throws a palm ball with he takes a different grip every single time he throws the pitch, and it just bugged me so much I couldn't keep reading and watching it, because I'm like, this
makes no sense.
It would never work. He would have no idea where the ball is going if he just imagine if you just grabbed the ball without looking at it and then just threw the pitch every single time.
Like a knuckleball.
Right.
Pretty much.
And they're telling me this guy can throw that for a strike consistently, and it's like a fastball. Like, what?
There were guys that, and the announcers would call it was a palm ball. I'm like, well, how the heck does he know? You can't really see his hand from
the closest, especially when they have multiple pitches, like, oh, that was the blank curve. It's like the guy throws 6 different curveballs. How did you know which one of them was which?
I tried to look at the current generation. So if you take the 2020s right now, it's like, so who are the dominant pitchers right now of this decade? And because we're only 3 years into it,
it's still kind of all the guys from the last decade.
I would probably put Garrett Cole at the front of that as a guy that I can count on to deliver, and who's going to likely deliver another
big fastball pitcher, big slider pitcher.
Yeah,
which kind of shows you where the modern pitch arsenal is, in a sense.
So, but the other guys just haven't even done it as long as Garrett Cole.
Right.
When you think about Shane McClanahan, he's had a few good years, and I know we're accepting Kershaw and Verlander and Scherzer, who are still pitching for goodness.
But they're Hall of Famers.
But they're Hall of Famers already. And so you mentioned Dylan Cease. That's another guy. So I'm looking for these guys who are kind of coming up that still have a lot of good years to pitch in the major leagues, looking at what are their arsenals and seeing how that's changing. For them to go forward and be able to be the guys that'll be considered for the Hall of Fame.
And just one last point, I was also thinking, I wonder if you're going to see starting pitchers have shorter careers nowadays. Because now to get guys out, they have to go in and they have to throw max effort so much more that even with the starting innings going down, I have to imagine that it's going to be so hard if you lose your top end stuff to reinvent yourself as a pitcher that guts it out. I don't think you're going to be able to make a career like that, like he kind of used to be.
I could see a team that doesn't have the top of the rotation type starter go to if you had a Joe Madden managing a team, going, okay, we're going to have 9. I wrote about this 9 3-inning pitchers on our team. We'll also have 4 relief pitchers that can come in short end. So there's our 13 guys, and basically they're interchangeable parts. I can pitch any one of these guys for 3 innings.
Any day.
And on any given day.
I'm not going to really...
Maybe I need to give him 1 day of rest or something like that in between in order to do that.
You have to give relievers.
And so that they can go max effort the entire time. And so I thought, wow, the owners would probably like that, because now I don't have to pay a star pitcher $55 million if he's only going to pitch 3 innings like
the
all the other guys.
The issue is that if you have
there.
a guy that goes out, throws the first 3 innings, and he looks amazing, are you going to really take him out of the game?
Well, that's our philosophy. That's what the manager said. This is our philosophy.
This
is the way we do it. And yeah, I don't know that you could hold that up. And it's so different. I mean, the order of the game is different, right? Because a guy that pitches 5 innings or 6 innings now, that's acceptable.
But I think that's how you're going to get innovation in baseball. Somebody's going to have to go and say, we're going to break the paradigm, because it's not like you're going to be able to invent some kind of new unhittable pitch these days.
No, and because of the pitch clock this year, there have been a few complete games, maybe a few more than I would have expected by this time. None by Sandy Alcantara, I don't think. Maybe he had one. And the point
Bassett just had a brilliant one the other day.
And so right, and because you're pitching faster, it's interesting that the opposite to a degree. I expected that pitchers would get gassed having to throw pitches every 15 or 20 seconds. And I guess if you're in a groove, you like pitching fast, and all of a sudden you're 2 hours and 5 minutes into the game and you're in the ninth inning. So you've only been pitching for 2 hours. Maybe you're not gassed. Maybe you're the opposite of that.
I think that's much more
Which is
likely.
really kind of interesting to me, because I thought the opposite would happen. So will we see more complete games from guys that are having a night? I'm starting to think that might be possible.
I think it is possible.
So, I think Arsenals I think you're just going to have more pitchers throwing more pitches in their repertoire because they have to.
Mm-hmm.